There was a moment, around 1870, when a single man's ships carried frozen lakes to the tropics, and kings in Calcutta cooled their wine with New England winter. He owned the ponds, the icehouses, the sawdust insulation, the harbor rights, and the schooners that crossed the equator without letting the cargo drip. He had turned water, free, common, falling from the sky, into a commodity worth a fortune per ton. He controlled the supply of coal itself in an age before refrigeration existed, and yet, within a decade of his peak, his empire would vanish so completely that most people today have never heard the phrase ice trade. What ended it was not a rival, not a war, not a scandal. It was something quieter, and he saw it coming, and he did nothing. To understand the fall, you must first understand how absurd the rise was. In the early 1800s, ice was a nuisance. It clogged mills, sank boats, and melted before anyone could use it. Our tycoon, a Boston merchant's son with more nerve than sense, looked at the frozen ponds of Massachusetts and saw not winter, but inventory. His first shipment, sent to the Caribbean in 1806, was mocked openly in the newspapers as a lunatic's errand. Half the cargo melted in transit, and he lost thousands. Investors called him deranged. But he had noticed one thing nobody else had. In a hot climate, cold was not a luxury, it was a craving, and a craving properly cultivated becomes a permanent market. So he did what every empire builder eventually does. He manufactured demand before he could satisfy it. He shipped ice to Havana at a loss, then gave bartenders free ice and free instruction in making chilled drinks. He seeded hospitals with ice to preserve the sick. He taught households to want cold butter, cold milk, cold rooms. Within a year, the same Cubans who had never seen ice could not imagine living without it. This is the hidden mechanism beneath every monopoly worth studying. You do not sell a product, you install a dependency. The genius was never the ice. It was engineering an entire population's expectations so thoroughly that going back to warm drinks felt like poverty. He was building addiction, one frozen block at a time. But installing demand only mattered if he alone could supply it. And here his ruthlessness sharpened. He raced to lock up the best ponds in New England, buying shorelines and harvesting rights before competitors understood what they were worth. He patented ice-cutting tools, horse-drawn plows that scored the frozen surface into perfect stackable blocks, doubling yield and slashing labor. He perfected sawdust insulation, a waste product from lumber mills he acquired cheaply, which let him ship across the equator with tolerable loss. Each innovation was a wall around his moat. Rivals who tried to enter found the good ponds taken, the tools patented, the shipping contracts sewn up. He had turned a free gift of nature into a fortress with a single gate, and he held the only key. Then came the shipment that made him legendary. In 1833, he loaded a vessel with 180 tons of Massachusetts pond ice and sent it around the Cape of Good Hope to Calcutta. A 4-month voyage through the tropics, across the equator twice. The British colonists there had begged for relief from the heat for generations. When the ship arrived, more than half the ice had survived. The colonists wept. They built him a grand icehouse at the port, granted him duty-free entry, and made him a folk hero of the Raj. India became his richest market. For the first time, a man had bent geography itself to his will, delivering New England winter to the sweltering Ganges. His name became a byword for the impossible made routine. At his zenith, He was moving well over 100,000 tons of ice a year to ports on 3 continents. He supplied the American South, the Caribbean, South America, and Asia. He owned or controlled the harvesting, the storage, the transport, and the retail. His imitators, and there were many now, mostly served him, cutting ice he bought or shipping on terms he set. Whole towns in New England lived and died by his harvest season. Fortunes rode on how cold each winter ran. He had done the thing every monopolist dreams of. He had made himself the indispensable middle of a market that could not exist without him. And that, precisely, was the seed of his ruin. Because an empire built on a free resource has one fatal weakness, the resource has no barrier to replacement. His entire fortress depended on a single assumption, that the only way to get cold was to harvest it from a frozen lake in winter and ship it thousands of miles. He had spent decades perfecting the logistics of moving nature's ice. What he never seriously reckoned with was the possibility that someone might learn to make ice, anywhere, in any climate, in any season, from a machine. And when that idea first appeared, it was crude, expensive, and unreliable. He glanced at it, judged it a toy, and returned to his ponds. That glance and that judgment would cost his heirs everything. The remedy is here. I promised you the quiet thing that killed him. It was mechanical refrigeration. As early as the 1850s, inventors were tinkering with compression machines that could freeze water using nothing but power and clever engineering. The first devices were monstrous, leaky, and dangerous. Icemen laughed. Why build a fragile machine that guzzled fuel when God froze the ponds for free every winter? The math seemed obvious. Natural ice was cheaper. And for a while it was. But the tycoons of ice mistook a temporary cost advantage for a permanent moat. They confused the state of the technology today with the trajectory of the technology tomorrow. That confusion is the single most common way empires die. Here is the original lesson buried in this frozen story, the one worth carrying out of this video. A monopoly on distribution is only as strong as the scarcity of the thing distributed. The Ice King never actually owned cold. He owned the hardest known way to get it. His entire fortune rested on the friction between a frozen pond in Maine and a warm glass in Calcutta. The moment a machine erased that friction, his ponds, his ships, his patents, and his icehouses became worthless in a way no rival could have made them. He was not defeated by a competitor playing his game better. He was defeated by someone changing the game, so the board itself disappeared. And the change came fast. 2 accidents accelerated it. First, a string of warm winters in the 1880s ruined harvests, sending natural ice prices soaring and giving factories a sudden, glaring reason to buy machines instead. Second, industrial pollution began fouling the very ponds the trade depended on. City ice grew unsafe to touch, let alone put in a drink. Suddenly, the machine that made clean ice on demand in July in any city, in any climate, was not a toy. It was salvation. Breweries, meat packers, and hospitals switched first, then households. The plants multiplied. The price of manufactured ice fell every single year, and the frozen lakes of New England, once worth fortunes, went back to being merely cold. The empire did not collapse in a dramatic crash. It melted, slowly, then all at once. Icehouses stood empty. The great harvesting crews disbanded. The specialized ships found no cargo. The patents protected tools nobody needed. Towns that had lived on the ice harvest fell silent. The trade that had once bent geography and shipped winter to the equator simply became obsolete, an entire global industry rendered pointless by a device you could install in a basement. Within a generation, the phrase "Ice King" sounded like something out of a fairy tale. The men who had ruled cold itself became a footnote, their names erased by the very abundance they had spent their lives fighting to prevent. What makes this fall so instructive is that it was entirely predictable and entirely ignored. The ice barons had decades of warning. They saw the machines improve. They read about the plants. But they were prisoners of their own success, too invested in ponds and ships and patents to imagine a world without them. This is the trap of the incumbent. The very assets that make you dominant become the anchors that drown you when the ground shifts. Their expertise in harvesting ice was worse than useless. It was a blindfold. They understood their industry so deeply that they could not see past it. And so they optimized a doomed business right up to the moment it ceased to exist entirely. There is a strange dignity in how completely they vanished. No villain toppled them. No bank foreclosed in scandal. No rival outmaneuvered them in a boardroom. They were simply made irrelevant by human ingenuity, doing what it always does, turning the scarce into the abundant. Every monopoly that rests on scarcity is, in the end, a bet against invention, and invention has never lost that bet for long. The Ice King's real mistake was believing that because he had conquered a market, he had conquered the need beneath it. He hadn't. He had only rented the gap between a problem and its solution, and one day, inevitably, someone closed the gap. That gap, between what's scarce today and what's abundant tomorrow, is where nearly every empire in history has quietly died, and it's the exact story this channel exists to tell. If you found something here, you'll actually remember the next time you watch a unbeatable giant get swept away, subscribe to magnates and monopolies. We hunt down the tycoons who ruled the impossible and the single overlooked shift that undid them, the boardroom coups, the cornered markets, the fortunes built and shattered. There's a new deep dive every week, and the next one is about a titan whose empire was even larger and whose fall was even faster. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and let's find out together who melts next.